Mike Lawson, founder and current general manager of Henry's Fork Anglers. Grew up in the watershed, has fished here his entire life. He's also fished around the world. He has a perspective on various things. His most recent book is this great little guide to fishing Henry's Fork. Bring that. John McDaniel in the center here has been fishing Henry's Fork for 40 years. His book here, Fly Fishing the Herman Ranch, is a fascinating compilation of extremely detailed information on that Reedy River. And John also, I believe I can say, has been a guide on the ranch section. You did officially not elect to continue this year, so you're a retired guide. Can I say that? You're a retired guide. So, so John wrote this book. He's here with us today. And then Brett Marshall sitting on the end, and Brett asked me to bring this thing. So I'm going to show and tell. So I brought up this. It's called a Hess sampler. And it's the thing that Brett uses and we use here on the Henry's Fork to sample aquatic invertebrates on the river bottom. And so you asked me to bring one. Brett is the president, proprietor, owner of River Continuum Concepts, which is an aquatic ecology consulting firm you're in Manhattan, Montana. And Brett has been in the invertebrate business for about 30 years. And Brett, I make sure I get this right. So you're also adjunct senior aquatic entomologist at the Academy of Natural Sciences at Drexel University. So, and Brett's worked all over the West. Admittedly, his experience on Henry's Fork is not nearly as long, but he has a very broad experience working in a variety of environments around the West. And he likes to tell me about it when he's here working with us in the field. So anyway, we'll get started here. I'm going to let Mike start, and Mike, just, whatever you want to say about hatches that you can say in 15 minutes or less.
All right.
Start in on it, and then we'll have John do the same.
Well, just to give you a little bit of background, it's like Rob said, I grew up here, and Grandpa grew up here, and so did my wife. Got a lot of long-term background here, but on the other side of it, I don't fish the Henry's Fork every day like John's done his whole. So I've got more of a, rather than just the ranch, I'm probably looking at a bigger perspective on the whole river. I live on the river down below St. Anthony, and it's where I live. Because I've fished this my whole life, all of us have seen changes with the aquatic insects, and it's kind of interesting the way the whole thing goes, because we got August coming up, and when we first opened our business in 1976, actually, that first 10 years or so, we had really lots of pale morning ducks that hatched all through the month. And some of these early so-called angler entomologists, and I'm doing this because I'm going to come back to this, but they identified these insects as small as another species of PMD. And the reason they did, the main reason, is they were smaller. We'd get them in June, and they'd be, some of them almost look as big as a size 14. And the ones in August were 18s and 20s, little guys. And so I always had some questions about all kinds of stuff, but as far as what I've seen changes with hatches, looking back, that's looking over 50 years there. That's changed quite a bit. A lot of the mayflies and stuff have it. Maybe the biggest change I've seen is in the caddisflies. And the one is the popular name was called the spotted sedge. It's a June caddisfly, and I think you know that caddisfly larvae are kind of three different types. You have the free roaming ones that just kind of like a mayfly nymph, just live around. Then you have net makers, and they're the most interesting to me because they make these little nets, and then that collects their food. And so they'll tend to keep relocating. And then you have the little case makers. And we have two major ones here. The case makers we have come out more in April, May. Consequently, their common name is the Mother's Day caddis. And then we get this other one. And I have photographs back in probably the 80s or so when he was just a punk kid with his voice. But we had incredible caddis hatches in the photographs. I've got some photos of Ernest Sweebert, who was an angling entomologist. And they were incredible hatches of these caddis. So anyway, those are some observations. And then I decided to write a different book than this. It's called Spring Creeks. It's not about Henry's Fork, it's about this kind of water. Tailwaters and spring creeks are very similar. They have the stable flow and the more constant water temperature is the closest thing with them. But when I started writing that book, I decided I don't know all that much about this kind of stuff that I thought I did. I kept struggling with it, and I decided to find an expert on every part of the book. Like when it was trout, there was a great trout biologist in Idaho State who's made a huge contribution to the Henry's Fork Foundation, Dr. Jack Griffith. But when I got to bugs, which is a pretty good part of the book, I really got pretty confused because I got all these old books that were written by these famous anglers that were explaining what all these bugs are, and they had all their scientific names and everything else. And in fact, a quick side story is I had some of these guys in the shop. They were throwing so much Latin around, you thought you were in Rome. And I didn't like it because it was intimidating to customers that were coming in and listen to this. And I had this guy come in, and he for sure he was a local guy. Had a John Deere hat on, and apparently that guy had been down in the ranch just killing the fish, just catching fish after fish. And one of these guys spotted him, wanted to go over there and wanted to know what he's using after they'd spread all this around. And he had some parachute atoms. He just holds them out and he goes, I don't know, I was just using these little gray suckers. Well, he didn't use the word suckers, but close. No, I mean, it couldn't have been better. But what I decided to do, because I'm looking for experts, I got to know Dr. George Edmonds at the University of Utah. And frequently I'd go to Salt Lake, and many of the times I went to Salt Lake, I went up and spent time with him in his office. And I always had a whole bunch of questions and I learned some things from him. It's interesting to look at, I don't remember what you call that thing, Rob.
Oh, test sample, yeah.
But a couple of things, and he didn't like these angling entomologists. He really didn't. He got pretty upset when they're writing as though they're an expert on aquatic insects. He'd rather have them stick to fishing, because for a number of reasons. They reclassify these bugs every so often. And if you don't know that, some of these early writers, they they had two species. It was really the same thing because they'd been reclassified. So that was an issue. The other thing is I always kind of had the idea that Henry's Fork on the ranch is the main reason it's so good is because of all the aquatic vegetation. I thought that's where all the bugs live, and they don't. He told me that the best place is to do just what they're doing, and he said by far a square foot of clean gravel is going to be the most productive kind of habitat for these aquatic insects, especially the caddisflies. I mentioned this one caddisfly that's really dropped way off, and these little larvae that I told you they were net makers, they have to have interstitial spaces between all the rocks so the water will flow through. So it starts getting piled up with some silt in there. They don't have a place to live. So I've noticed they've dropped off quite a bit. They've kind of come back a little bit from where they were. But the biggest question I had with him, rather than talking about individual bugs, was a question that we get now all the time, and that is, why are the bugs so erratic? Now, I do think we had better patches back when I was writing that, but it's still sort of the same issue. And the thing I noticed, and most of us do that fish, is on a bright, sunny, warm day like today, you don't get the hatches you would on a cloudy, cool day. That was a big question I had, and here's the answer I got from him, is there's really no difference in how many bugs emerge on a given day. He told me that if I don't believe that, where do all the spinners come from? You have these summer days like this, where it's hot and dry, and you go out there and you don't see any mayflies. But then early the next morning or that evening, there's spinners all over. That was a question I had. Why is that? And I thought that might be interesting to mention that to this group today as to what the answer was. This isn't me, this is what George Edmonds said. As he said, the idea that you get like double or triple the amount of mayflies that hatch on a cloudy, cool day is wrong. He said they about the same amount of them hatch every day. But the days that it's cloudy, these insects, especially mayflies, they thrive on dark humidity. They like humidity. But on these kind of days, you almost never see them because their hatches are spread throughout the day, and they, without the cold weather, it takes them almost nothing to emerge. They just hit the surface and they're gone. So you really don't see them. And I experienced that a little bit on the Henry's Fork, on the ranch, and down below the ranch is because, in fact, I was sort of amazing myself the other day. I was fishing, and there was a couple of fish rising, and I looked at those fish, and I thought, you know, I don't think I've ever seen a trout on the ranch or actually eat it done. I mean, they'll sit there and rise, and you see these mayfly duns float right over them, and then they see them rise again. And they just become accustomed. This is just my opinion. This is not George Edmonds. I'm splitting it up. But that's kind of what I've run into. But basically, that was one of the biggest things that I learned. And then the other thing now that I've learned, it sort of goes along with that, is I think right now the Henry's Fork Foundation is maybe, I wouldn't use the word criticism, maybe a little misunderstood right now, because their findings are sort of contrary to what anglers are really seeing on the river. I'm not sure they believe them, because the number of aquatic insects isn't what it was. I'll admit that. But compared to most other rivers, it's still very healthy. And when they do this, they get a tremendous amount of aquatic insects. And that's the other thing I learned from Dr. Edmonds is you can't look at the adult levels or stages of these aquatic insects. You have to focus on what's under the water, they lived there all year. For a year, they're only an adult for a little while. So I don't know, that's pretty much, you got any other things on it?
That's perfect.
All right, that's it for me.
Yeah, and I'm gonna, since you, what'd you call me? What'd you say?
I said you were,
all right.
He was not, we saved our business. We'd have never survived without him.
All right, so because he called me that, I'm gonna interject my own personal angling experience, not anything based on this thing, because I'm going to leave that for Brett, and probably say some of the same things that John's going to say, and I'll agree with Mike. One of the most noticeable change I've seen, I agree completely, it's the evening caddis. That you'd open the car door, and in a minute there'd be 100 of them in the vehicle, and in the time you'd put your waders on, or at the end of the evening when you'd drive home, and the next morning the cab of the truck is just full of dead caddisflies. I mean, every day you'd have to clean caddisflies out of the pickup. And the other thing, and Brett and I talked about this, and you can chime in on that too, is if you drove, say, from West Yellowstone to Ashton in June or July or even August 40 years ago, you'd have to stop and clean your windshield off once. I drive all over the West all summer, and I clean my windshield maybe once in the whole summer. And Brett and I had that same conversation the other day. So I'll interject that in terms of, yes, from an angling perspective, from that sort of the personal experience.
Let me add one thing.
Oh, yeah, okay.
I'm not going to take them, but the guy that was a very good friend and a well-known angling entomologist was Ernie Schweber. And we were fishing one night over across the river, and those caddis were so thick that he was coughing and breathing them in. We went and got a hamburger, and I said, he was still coughing. I said, Jesus, are you all right? And he said, oh, I got a case of bronchitis.
So anyway, I just want to, thanks for that, because I was thinking of bronchitis when I was talking about so John, why don't you, and I should point out what Mike said, which is that John, I was trying to figure out how many days you've spent on the ranch, and it became a pretty large number, but over 100 days for 40 years. So in terms of the number of days somebody's actually spent on the ranch day in and day out, I don't know that anybody can match the number of days. So that's why you're here, Don. So go ahead.
I certainly don't have the number of years that Mike or Renee Harrop had, but I was fortunate. I was a university professor, and at the age of 41, I came out here. For years, I never came because everybody said it was for experts, and I wasn't an expert. And then a student of mine convinced me to come. I fell in love with the place. But the days, I don't have the day count, but I was obsessive enough to count the hours. Right now, it's at 15,113 hours on the ranch. Now, the reason for that is I convinced the university to allow me to bring students out to do archaeology. I wasn't on the sites that archaeologists wasn't from there. For 3 months I did that, and then I had I made the decision reluctantly to guide 25 years ago, and I was way over a minute of it. But what I'm going to say is a little different. I'm not a fisheries biologist, I'm not an entomologist, but I've spent a lot of time on the ranch. And my general perception is that there's been a dramatic decline in fishery, particularly in the last several years. Again, I have attributed it to dramatic decline in aquatic insects. Now, I'm not out there sampling them. I'm not looking for the nymphs. What I did from day one was, well, I'm not an entomologist. I have a PhD, so I learned how to collect data. And my PhD is in archaeology, which is a little different. But we collect data. And from day one, I started collecting data. I was desperate to learn as much as I could, as fast as I could. So I would keep track of every fish that I caught and what the insect was I took it on. And with no perception that in a number of years it would show some stunning sort of differences in the production of aquatic as opposed to terrestrial insect, I suddenly came up with, I have to look at my notes now, but I suddenly came up with these variations that I think are relevant to why some of us think, this is a harsh thing to say, but some of us think the fishing on the ranch is declining dramatically. So in the period from 1983 to 2011, my clients and I took 76% of our rainbow boats on imitations of aquatic insects and 24% on imitations of terrestrials. Now those are dry flies. We're talking about dry fly fishing here. This is not dry heads or stripping leeches or anything like this. This is purely dry fly fishing is what we did. And that has changed dramatically in the latter period. And as far as terrestrials were concerned, I'm sorry, I mixed up here a little bit. For the period of 2012 through 2022, we took 46% on aquatic insects and 54% on terrestrials. That's a tremendously dramatic change there. The most dramatic shift in productivity occurred with two types of aquatic insects and two types of terrestrials. In the first period, caddis adults, and obviously huge numbers of different caddis adults. But PMD duns took no less than 311 rainbows, or 20% of the 1,523 fish we found. In the period from 2018 to 2023, we took only 29 rainbows in the combined PMDs and caddis, which is only 5.4%. So it was a quarter of what we're taking before, and it's obviously dramatically different. In shocking contrast, hoppers and flying black ants took 111 of the 1,523 rainbows landed in the first period, only 7%. In the recent period of 2018 through 2023, hoppers and black flying ants took an astounding 302 rainbows, or 57% of all fish taken on dry ranges. You know, you can say, well, you decided to fish hoppers more than you didn't want to fish. I'd much rather fish PMDs and caddis imitations than hoppers. But when you've got clients who pay the fees they have, you want to fish the fish. So we fish what we thought would give the best chance of doing it. And it's been a dramatic change in terms of trying to meet the needs of these people that are paying to fish. So that dramatic decline is obvious. I tend to see it, again, I'm not a fishery biologist, but I think it's had a lot to do with the decline in our fishing in the last 5 years. And when we speak to that, let me give you a few numbers that I have here that I think provide some data on that that's informative. 2020, not that long ago, we landed one rainbow for every 3.6 hours of fishing. You know, every 3.6 hours of fishing, you have a lay down day, you got a shot at landing 2 or 3 rainbows. Those of you who fish the ranch a lot, I think, know that 3 fish in a day, it's a good day on the ranch. You can catch 40 fish on the Madison, on the ranch, you're not going to catch 40 fish in a day. That's a good day. But if we turn up to 2023, and we look specifically at the number of days I guided in 2023, that was 20. My wife had a health problem, so I didn't guide as much as I did in other years. But what we face. It's the same guy and the same quality of anglers. Obviously, there's some that aren't as skilled, and some that are very skilled. But there's not, nobody's going to say back in the day, we had all great anglers and now we don't. It's just so. Another experience I had just recently was 3 years ago, in 2021. I had two guys who were regulars on the Delaware, the upper Delaware. A lot of people would fish that a lot. I'm not one of those people. But the people who have say that's imposes the same kind of challenges that Daniel Ford does. So these guys came out here, and in 2021, they had great fishing. Incredible. They fell in love with the range. They landed on one day, one of the guys landed 4 fish, and the other one landed 3. These are all between 17 inches and over. I'm talking about dinks. And with that success, they were thrilled about coming back. They come back in 2022. This is again getting a little personal. My wife had breast cancer surgery on the day I was supposed to be, one of the 3 days I was supposed to be dying. I didn't die. And they had 3 days of very poor fishing. You know, one year to the next, they said, well, John was enthusiastic about coming back the next year. So they came this year. The guy, one of the two guys is, in my opinion, the finest angler I've ever guided, and I've guided some superb anglers. 2 guys from New Zealand. It'll be interesting to see what Mike's fix on this is in terms of ranch fishing. Darryl Pascal is the finest angler. He's a friend of Nelson Chiana's. We go out to the Avenue of Giants in the morning. It's hail. Most people run off the river. We stay there and grit our teeth. We ran back to trout hunter to try to warm up at one point. And I said to him, I said, you know, I think we have a chance for bugs if we go back. We caught a couple of fish before we went back to trout. And the one kid says to me, good on you, mate. so we go back. They land 12 fish. That's a hell of a day on the ranch. I mean, I would look up. Unbelievable fishing that these guys have. I think the guy from the Delaware is better than either of these. So he comes back this year, and it's a disaster. It's such a disaster. He writes me a note. I had surgery this spring, and I made a wise decision not to go. I had trouble. Got to the doctor next year, and I had trouble getting him out of the water. So they come back, and this guy writes me this note, which I will, and I will concede that there are people out there in this audience that had great days. But what you're seeing now is many more days like this. I got his permission to read this, but this is what the guy says. I mean, this guy was getting great for 70 feet. I mean, I heard myself going, oh my, and on what this guy was doing. And I've seen some superb anglers, Japanese anglers, some great American anglers, obviously, but South African anglers, there's some great anglers out there from around. So here's what he says to me. It was not good. Joe and I only caught 12-inch fish. Never saw any other hook fish. I did see the coach. That's good. I saw him catch one in the channels. We couldn't believe it. Today was a 0 for us. I cast 2 one-timers. May not come back. You know, that's a hard thing for a guy who loves the range like I do to hear a client say. Yesterday we fished 14 hours, and they're fit. I guarantee you, for 14 hours. Wood Road first, then walked in at the mailbox, had a few leaders in the distance, but no real chances. Then did the channel, saw no one else hooked up. I embrace failures, but I need chances. To work as hard as we did to not get a reasonable number of shots is very disappointing. Losing interest in the harem, and I ain't no sissy. I came here thinking skill mattered. I thought it was a very technical fishery. But if you get no chances, or you need luck to get chances, your skill is irrelevant. I know I can cover fishery with marginal opportunities, but I've had so few reasonable or marginal chances in the last 2 years that I feel like I'm wasting my time. Now, obviously, that's one person's opinion, but it's guys years ago had what I thought was the finest fishery we ever had. And if you want to argue that, well, you know, maybe they didn't bring the right flies, you know, you were there and you had the right flies. I tell you what I did. I knew when they were coming. I knew what kind of flies they were. I gave them plenty of Harris flies for every pattern. I mean, they had the flies, and these guys were superb casters, and they had a terrible day. I mean, it's just, and I honestly, my perception, obviously I'm not a fishery biologist, but my perception is that the decline in the aquatic insects is probably the most powerful thing that's created. I had my own caddis story, you know, in terms of this phenomenal difference in caddis in the past and caddis now. My story, we drove from Haven to Last Chance once. I looked at the license plate in front of our car. This is in 1983. I looked at the license plate in my car and I can't read it. It's got an inch thick of calves on it. Try to find that now. My story about people talking about aquatic insects, not a fly fisherman. I have a good friend. He's a truck driver. He's also part of the cell. And he's an avid wild turkey. I'm an obsessive wild turkey. One time I asked him, he enjoys driving trucks. One time I asked him, I said, what's the greatest difference in driving trucks today and driving trucks 20 years ago? Is it the speed of vehicles on some of these roads now at 80 miles, speed limits? Is it that you got so many RVs that the quality of the roads, the interstates are breaking up? He said, no, God, John, it's the bugs. I said, what? He said, we don't have to worry about the bugs anymore. You know those places where you fish? There are no bugs there. We couldn't keep them off our screen. I mean, you guys have said that. But again, you know, it's not just coming from the people who fly fishing. I mean, there are things going on with aquatic insects. I mean, I'm not pretending I have an answer to it, but it seems to me, you know, that is so clearly one of the things that's happening here. Okay, I'll change pace a little bit here and say that I fished my first at 4 hours yesterday. One of the reasons I did was I was coming to this meeting. I decided to fish in the afternoon. So again, just to everyone, I know all these variables. I see them every morning in the parking lots. I mean, I'm sorry, but it is uniform, their comments about how important fishing in the ranches. Just one person to the next, to the next. Going other places. I'll embarrass my friend Gary. I called Gary and I said, how was the ranch today? I didn't fish the ranch today, John. I'm in the park. That hasn't happened once. That's happened multiple times. He'll confirm that. Yesterday, I go to the ranch, and this is a little different perspective on what the ranch is all about. I walk into the ranch parking lot. It's the first time I've been there this summer. Usually, I'm there every weekend. I see 2 regulars there. You know, the joy of seeing those guys. There's something else about ranch fishing besides how much fish you fish. It's sort of the subculture of ranch fishing. I mean, it was so enjoyable to see those guys interacting. Their reports on the fishing were not positive. But I sort of had been ready for that. Now, I will also say that obviously there's some great fishermen that are having good days. And one of the guys I trust as much as anybody, Frosty from Jackson, Wyoming, he's a remarkable character. He told me about a great day he had in the island. And then that I don't dispute. But what I'm talking about is what you're going to face if you take clients out. And I will say, in the last 4 years, it has been exceedingly good. To finish my story about going to the ranch, I started walking down the river. And, you know, obviously I'm impressed as I always am with the beauty of the place, and I started feeling good about being there. And I see 3 pairs of anglers. And again, the most amazing thing about this ranch experience is I know all 3 pairs of anglers. One pair I've interacted with, and the other, honestly, got my memory. I knew I knew him from somewhere, but I couldn't remember if I got it or not. And I just enjoyed talking to them. You know, that was part of it. Their reports were all negative. The pair, of which there was a husband and a wife, vineyard in California. It's incredible. Every year they come, and I got in for 3 or 4 years, and then they start fishing. It's happened like it happens with a lot of guys when people get to know. Every year they unbelievably great. I mean, I'm not sophisticated enough to know how good it is. But people doing those kinds of relationships you form with people just make this experience so profound and enjoyable. So then I leave them and I head down to the ranch. I'm only at the first irrigation. I go I wanted to test the water in Antelope Spring Creek. I was talking to Rob about this a second ago. But I start going down the Hopper Bank and then angle over to Antelope Spring Creek and then head down to the islands. I don't see a single angler. I go to the top of the big island, I go all the way to the Avenue of the Giants. You know, it's 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I don't see any fish rising. I don't see a single aquarium. True, not a single one. But I see hoppers. And I'm fishing hoppers. And I'm not getting fish to take out. I continue my walk through the water, and I get to at the top of at the top of Trico Bay, and I'm casting my hopper, not anticipating anything, and this terrific rainbow comes up, takes the hopper, fights like only ranch rainbow can, and I'm thrilled. I'm thrilled as if it's my first day on the ranch. I land the fish, and the other aspect of this, it's very interesting to me, is that our fish look great. Not just this year, but as you've gone back through the years, and I get a lot of photographs from people about fish they catch in Montana. You know, the weight for length of fish, and our fish, I think, are as healthy looking as any you see. And this 20.5-inch rainbow is classically that. So, you know, I'm thrilled. I walk back, the heat's beating me to the ground this time. But I kind of think to myself, is there a chance we adjust to what we're facing now in terms of what this guy from Delaware said? Do we kind of accept the fact that we're not going to have 12 fish a day in the ranch again, but can we enjoy the 1 or 2 fish a day and make that compatible for us? I don't know what the answer to that is. I mean, I came off that experience. Maybe that's something we have to adjust to. You know, it's very easy to just sit up here and say, the fishing is terrible for all these days. I've said that, you know, this guy's not going to come back again. That's really hard for me to accept. But is it possible to do that? The only thing that's tough about that is, you know, I can go out there and, you know, I'm not paying a lot of money to go out there. And that's one of the wonderful things about the ranch. There's no fee to fish it. I mean, it costs me an IL license. But these guys are paying high fees for this. And if they're just consistently not getting fish, is that reasonable? Can we accept that? What do we say? Is it going? You know, are we confident it's going to return to our fund? Let me give you one other story about throwing the dollar sign in. So I'm on the ranch one day, and a guy that a good number of you know, but I won't mention his name, comes up to me and says, "John, you got to go to Iceland for freelance." I said, "God, that's prohibitively expensive." The next says to me, he sort of grimaces and he says, "Yeah, the 4 best rivers in Iceland really are pretty expensive." I didn't have a clue what it was, but I thought I had the right to ask after he's kind of put this before me. So I said, what are you talking about? This wasn't last year. My guess was it was maybe 4 or 6 years ago. He said the rod fee, $3,000 to $4,000 a day. Okay, we're not paying that to fish the ranch. But if their fishing declines to the point where who's going to pay that? I mean, you pay for a guide as well, you pay for lodging, you pay for travel, you pay for food. what's a week gonna cost? I mean, you gotta think about it. You know, when I have a guy come for 3 days and he doesn't land fish, I mean, I feel like I've failed. And right now, it's easy to be in that position. 20 guy trips last year. 12 guys didn't land a fish or one didn't land a fish. 12 out of 20. That's not easy to tolerate. And I mean, I'm not talking about going 2 hours. Our average days like last year were 10.5 hours a day. And that's not 2.5 hours drive. It's 3 minutes drive from the travel to the top of the ring. The whole rest of it is walk and wait until you can barely stand up. And you still come up with what I'm talking about. So, for those of you who have been justified for me for saying things about the decline of the fishery, hopefully that explains a little bit about why we feel that way. And also, I wonder, is it capable of turning around? I don't think that's an irrelevant question at this juncture. I don't think it's capable. I don't think it's irrelevant to ask that harsh question. I mean, I know how hard Rob works, and I know how talented he is, but can we legitimately turn it around? Is it climate change? We're talking about water temperatures. The reason I went down there yesterday, really, I didn't think I'd fish much. The reason I went down there, I wanted to check the temperature in Antelope Spring Creek, because I tested the water at the temperature in there about 10, 15 years ago, when it was in the high 50s. It was a Spring Creek temperature. 2 years ago, I tested it, and it was like 70 degrees. I thought, that can't be true. I thought something was wrong with my thermometer. And a guy who sells fly fishing equipment told me it could have been the thermometer. He says those things make a lot of mistakes. So now I carry 2. So I went there yesterday. The temperature in the water off the hopper bank was 72 degrees at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. That's brutal. But guess what it was in Antelope Spring Creek? 74 degrees, did I say that? Yep. Antelope Spring Creek was 72 degrees. I was eager to see Rob because I figured, how the hell does that happen? I mean, I tested that when it was is climate change doing that? I took those temperatures the previous time in the same spot I took them this time. The other story, Rob and I were talking this, and I'll conclude here, but Rob and I were talking about this a little earlier. One time I drove in to fish the channels, and I'm looking out at Silver Lake there, and I think to myself, my God, that river must get hot here. And I think, I think I'll take the temperature where it runs into the 3rd channel. So I went down preparing to fish, and I took the temperature. Guess how much warmer the water was that went into the 3rd channel from Silver Lake? How much higher the temperature that water was?
It's ridiculously warm.
10 degrees warmer.
Yeah.
Are we, is there something we can do about that? 10 degrees. I took the temperature right above where it came in, and it was 10 degrees cooler than it was. You got some spring creek. And God, the most important spring we have is that big Osborne spring. That's why so many people go to the water spring. Is that everything about what's causing this, from my perspective, catastrophic decline in fishing? I don't have an answer for it, but I'm concerned. Thank you.
John, thank you very much. I really appreciate you being willing to tell your story. I was going to jump in a minute ago, but I thought I'd let you finish. The subtitle of his book is Lessons Learned and Friends Made, Sight Fishing the Selective Trout. And so I appreciate you talking about the friends you have made. It's the subtitle of the book, so I appreciate that very much. So I'm going to...
This subculture of ranch angling, this is 2 seconds. It's
between you two guys,
it's just, it's the most wonderful thing. I hope you have an opportunity to experience. Really, there's no other group of people that I include more in my life. really been phenomenally positive for me.
And I also appreciate the questions, because these are the questions we sit around and try to figure out every day. That's a topic of another seminar, but I want to give Brett, so Brett, you have the advantage, I guess, now of going last, because you've heard some of these observations, and some of them are the things we talked about, the bugs on the windshield and these kind of things, and other places in Montana and so on. So anything that you'd like to say in the temporal or spatial context?
So, yeah, just first of all, I probably know less about Rick than anyone in this room. I just, my experiences, my I've been doing bugs for 37 years now, specifically working with them, and it gives me different kinds of information. I would have really loved George Edmonds, right? He's doing some of his keys, and speaking to those taxonomic changes, right? Back when he wrote most of his keys to the Fenn Islands, Drenata was a subgenus of Fenn Islands, so they all would have been pet-like dogs back then. So the systematic changes, and also it's those findings that intimidate me. I never have the Latin, right? You know, what is a spotted fish, right? Scared.
Hydrocyclic.
What is a size 18, right? Those things scare me. Another interesting thing I was wondering, the only species from Cinderella that we found in the river was excrucians, right? The limiting part of our experience is we're using these devices, we're doing it on St. Patrick's Day, right, the same time every year. And to identify the species, you need to measure the length of the front leg, right? And so if you have immature specimens, obviously the legs are shorter, right? So we just can't identify. George put in the length of the leg is a certain so we can't actually use that. The method that we're using is we're taking the S sampler, right? It's a tenth of a square meter, or about a square foot. Except that it's round, so it's not really square, right? But he calls
I shouldn't have said that. He was about this tall.
I call him Legolas.
He was the smartest guy I'd ever met at that age. He would do these. I'm not going to get into it. This guy's smart. Believe me.
Definitely lucky to have Rob working on this, because if I drop something about a statistical concern, it picks up on it right away. A lot of I have to explain it, he's still not going to do it. But yeah, I call him Legolas because when we go out, it's St. Patrick's Day, there's still a lot of snow up here, right? I'm the fattest guy with the smallest feet, so I'm host over the place, but he's scampering across the top of the snow like rings, right? So anyway, so we go out and we do, we have 3 of these hours, and Henry's work was 2, and we place down 6 of these, and we scrub off all the rocks in the area, right? It's very quantitative, and everything gets, upstream side is here, the downstream side is here, everything goes through and gets caught in this, which we jar up and take it back to the lab and they through it with microscopes and tweezers to get all the bugs out. And so it's one of the other limitations is that there's so many bugs out there, right? And not just in the Henry's Fork, but in the world, right? One sample I was working for a consulting firm out of Moscow, Idaho. We had one sample from Maine that had about 1.5 million bugs, right? And that particular year, there were 55 entomologists working for that company, and we identified a total of 1.5 million bugs. Right, so you have to have some sort of subsample, right? There's no way to identify everything unless you're going to pay 55 people for one sample, right? That's just not realistic, right? So hundreds of thousands of dollars for one sample. So we have a way of selecting a random number of animals. For this project, since we have 6 replicates, it's 200. Right? So we identified 200. And so the densities can change based on how many you find. So we tend to use percent abundance measures for that, right? Most often. And so the EPTs they are usually 50% of the community. They've kind of stayed that way here, right? The bugs in the water are different than the ones you probably see emerging, right? And the pollution tolerance index is pretty good, right? It's low. It's around 4. In regional context, at the Big Hole River, right, over the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen at some of the locations that the abundance of caddisflies, mayflies, and stoneflies go down from 65 to 75% of the community down to 17 or 18% of the community steadily over the years, right? So, and what happened there is an increase in ridges and tiny worms, right? And these worms are really, really tiny, but they can have a density of 200,000 per sample, right? Which, using a randomized technique to pull things out, means that they can just kind of numerically surpass everything. And both of these studies, however, we use a large rare search, so pulling out all the stoneflies anyway, right, to get around that quantitative bit. So we have some ways to do. So Select County, another place where I do a lot of work in Wyoming, just kind of over the mountains. I've seen those little worms go from being 8 to 15% of the community to being 85 to 90% of the community, right? So there's all these little worms that are becoming more abundant, which may be a trade-off from some of the insects. However, there are a ton of insects in the areas where we aren't seeing those same changes here. Everything's pretty steady. Right? I guess some other things I've seen in my experiences are the Mother's Day caddis. Okay, all over my windshield. Right? We actually have 2 species in Henrysville. Right? We have Brachycentrus americanus and the Brachycentrus occidentalis, the traditional Mother's Day caddis. Right? And they comprise about 1% of these samples, 1 to 2% of these samples. Right? They're not hugely abundant. However, I talked to all my friends several times now. I've used the caddis flags for the Smithsonian for a long time and died about it. It's been about 10 years already. But the difference between those, he said, is that occidentalis, traditional Mother's Day caddis, can tolerate slightly warmer water than Brachycentrus americanus. He also said that Brachycentrus is a genus of filter feeding caddis, right? They're an opportunistic predator as well. Right? They have a square case, and they take some of their silk and they rock, and they take that front edge and they glue it down so they can let go of the legs, and then they spread their legs like this, right? And they'll grab a mayfly that floats by and eat it, right? They're opportunistic predators, right? But what they're really doing most of the times, they have these tiny little spines on their form, right? And bacterial-sized particles get caught in that, right? Brachycentrus occidentalis has longer little spines on its legs, right? So it takes off hugely, right? If there's sewage in the water, right? So at downstream of Livingston, Montana, on the other side, right? There's a huge hatch of Brachycentrus occidentalis. There was until they upgraded their sewage treatment plant, right? And then suddenly the Mother's Day caddis bought that because it took away the food supply, which and somebody else was eating those things, right? There's a whole lot of function underwater that we can talk. I just know a little bit about the bugs that we observe. But and rather than going into statistical concerns of these types of sampling devices, I guess I take questions, and I don't really have those.
I have one already.
There you go.
We talk about these hatches. The Mother's Day caddis is a perfect example. Is the last 2 or 3 years, I've never seen as heavy Mother's Day caddis hatches as I have the last 2 or 3 years in a stretch below where Warm River comes into the Henry's Fort down to then we have another reservoir. But those things are just massive down there. I've got some video and lots of pictures and stuff. And then there are quite a few of them below the Ashton Dam, but not quite as many. And there's hardly anything up here with those. So is there?
Where the reach he's talking is where we do our Ashton sample.
Yeah,
that's the one, you know, with the islands where, so that reach is the one that he said has the good
That's
brackets.
where I've seen the most, and then
which is what we see.
And then I don't see anything up here like we used to see. So I don't know if that's a question or a big question mark. I'll just put it there.
So again, that reservoir is downstream of that location, or
the reservoir is downstream. We sample there at those islands. That's just upstream of the Ashton Reservoir.
I'd be guessing about why at this point, why that would be.
You know, we have some really cold weather up here, and it'll freeze the river. But it really doesn't freeze it down there too much. I think it does a little bit, not like it does up here. So, you know, it's just a bit of a mystery to me, is all.
Yeah. There's a lot of mysteries out there. That's one of the things I think, you're a professor, right? One of the things, and things you learn is that in graduate school, you kind of you don't really know anything, right?
And then 30 years later, you learn that you don't know anything.
Exactly. Yeah, so I don't know why that would be off the top of my head. I know the habitat is really different than that beach.
Yeah,
from the
it is.
It's really kind of a complex, slippery, hollow system, right? And so there's lots of microhabitats for lots of different kinds of bugs, right? So lots of interstitial spaces. Honestly, one of the things I thought was really good about this river compared to others was the low abundance of hydrocycles, right? You like them. Spotted sedges.
Yes, right. That's the one he's calling spotted sedge, the hydrocycus.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
you have two species, mostly hydrocycles, also hydrocycles here, and they do quite well right below downstream of a particular resource coming down, or downstream of probably coarser particles than black flies or brachycefalus, right? So you can see a gradation below down where they eat the coarser particles, and then downstream you see more brachycefalus. So there are lots of little things going on with them. In those interstitial spaces, right, there's also lots of different microflow regimes, right? So the bottom of the river is in the river, right? There's lots of water moving through the rocks, even laterally, right? So that is a very complex reach of the river. So they could be living happy little lives well below our sample device.
Rob, can I ask a question?
Sure, yeah, Jack, and we'll
Does
see
the-
other folks have questions.
Does the evidence of the entomological surveys that we've done, does it support the anecdotal comments relative to there being fewer insects? In other words,
Well, I haven't been doing anything for 40 years, right? So, I don't, the timescale of this is a lot different. It's been close to 10 years. There are a lot of ephemeral samples, right? More than I've.
PMDs.
Yeah. There are a lot of PMD samples, right? They, I don't know, they can comprise of half of the sample or something like that, right? Different language, but they comprise a lot. And a lot of other rivers I work on, it's close to 5%.
Do you measure things in percentage of sample, or do you measure sheer numbers in terms of quantities?
We do both. Yeah. Like I said, there are certain limitations to that because of the way the sample is collected, right? And so a good example of that is, so we take a fixed number of animals, right? So the way that goes is, in microbiology, right, you do these serial dilutions, right? Like 10th of a sample till you get something where you can actually count the colonies. And we do something similar with substandard bugs, where we have a quartered sieve, right? One of my Dunstan dragons, I we pick a quarter, right? And then that quarter gets moved to another sieve, spread out, float, spread out, roll the dice again, take another quarter, take that quarter, put it in a dish that's already got quarters in it, right? And it's a process that we get down to a 64th of the sample, or sometimes even smaller, and then we take everything, right? And so I've had streams in Wyoming, right, where I'm doing that, and it comes down to we actually only use 1/3% of the sample, right? So that it's the equivalent of looking at a 1.5-inch square of the bottom, right? So we haven't had that problem here. Everything is consistently around 5 to 10% of the sample, which is ideal for the sample, but it is one of the limitations of comparing what we're seeing in densities to other streams, right? But they're like, 1 to 5%.
But you haven't seen a lot of drop off in sheer numbers based on the pattern.
No. They consistently do, regardless of how many. That's why I say, if we we're looking at 200, but it's about the same portion of the area every time we do here. It's very consistent, and so I haven't seen over these 10 years any indication of a decline in those refunds, right? So that doesn't mean that the hatches aren't changing. The hatches are the way we like them. Officially like them. People think there's an aquatic entomologist, that must be an amazing fly fisher, but I catch way more bugs than fish. Right. So,
But just, I did bring a few numbers in case we had this kind of discussion, but yeah, we have seen no decline in the last 10 years. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of data. Well, we don't have any data that are comparable the way Brett does it. Nobody does things as detailed and as carefully as Brett Marshall. That's one thing. It's hard to go back and use somebody else's. Jack Griffith had students do this stuff, but the methods and so some of the rough things like percent mayfly, stoneflies, caddisflies, maybe the Hilsenhoff index, some of those relative metrics are sort of comparable, but it's really hard to take Brett's work and then find some random stuff from 1990, if it even exists, and compare. But let me give you a couple numbers and Brett can comment on, you asked just sheer abundance. So at Flat Rock, which is the best by any metric of our sites on the Henry's Fork, the average number of pale morning duns over all the years we've done this is almost 20,000 individuals per square meter of stream bottom. Pale morning duns.
Which is amazing, right? I never get to see that.
And then at last chance, it's about 5,000 individuals per square meter, and at Osborne Bridge, the average is about 10,000 per square meter. So that's pale morning duns. Even at St. Anthony, our site's near the cemetery, clear near the very bottom of our irrigation system, way down at the lower part of the watershed, you still have 4,000 pale morning duns per square meter of stream bottom. And Brett, you could, comment on where do you see that anywhere else?
I never can see that anywhere else. But again, it's hard to compare with other surveys because one of things my lab does is we do quality assurance checks on other labs, right? And we found, so what happens is after we get done processing our part of the sample, right, we save everything we looked through in a little jar, right? And we archive that little jar. And sometimes we send those little jars out to other labs and they try to find bugs that we missed, right? And we have to have more than 90% of the bugs found in the first push through. And my lab runs easily 95 to 99% on that average. So when we're doing those checks on heart service labs or USGS labs or university labs, I find anywhere from 49% to 75% efficiency on it. So some of the stuff where you see lower densities of small bugs can be due to students and bug pickers, right? They're just ready to go to class, right? Right. So yeah, but personally myself with my own lab, I've never seen those kinds of densities.
I have one last question.
What John
Short of it being what Mike had referred to earlier, which I think the general consensus among those of us who fish the river often is that we kind of hang our hat on Mike's theory of it being something that's, instead of happening in a concentrated period of time, because we all tend to agree we see really good, reasonably good spitter falls. We're not seeing the emergence happen at a certain time of day that you at one point can almost set your clock to. Mike subscribes to the idea that it's maybe trickling off through the course of the day, which makes a lot of sense. But the question is there anything that could happen to that insect between the time that you do your survey to prevent that insect from a full emergence? Is there anything that could get in the way of that happening?
Other things, a lot of these types of surveys by the state or other people are done sometime between July and October, right? Which is the worst possible time to do this because the bugs can come off at different times of year based on the temperature of the water, right? So if we sample them, let's say we sampled on August 1st every year, right? Some bugs might have emerged 3 weeks before that year, 3 weeks after. It's a bad source of variation. So we collect on St. Patrick's Day every year, right? Before, which is a great time because the bugs are big. They've been growing all winter long. They've been there for at least 6 months, right? They still have time for things to happen to them, right? I've never seen the Henry's work freeze, but apparently it does, right? So, those kinds of things can happen. They could emerge earlier. They could emerge less synchronously over days as well as because some of the thermal cues might be missing as things become warm, right? So I don't know what will happen to them, but certainly there's time between their emergence and when we collect them for things to go south. As I understand, talking to Rob, these densities correspond pretty highly to what we've seen, right? In that emergence. You said one time that
there are many, if not most of the years since we've been doing Brett's careful sampling. 2020 is a great example. Hatches were great in 2020. John mentioned that was a good year, and that was the highest PMD abundance we've ever seen at Last Chance. Of course, same with caddis. That was our top year for the hatches that we saw in 2020. 2022, bugs were down in the benthic sample. They were down in the hatches. It's not perfect. It's not one-to-one, but in general, you can see the year-to-year variability in the benthic sample, that thing, and in the hatches. The one thing about, can something happen to those insects, of course, but the fact that next March on St. Patrick's Day, there's just as many as there were the year before, means that obviously you have a self-sustaining reproductive population that, even if not forming a fishable hatch, is certainly replacing themselves, and there's 20,000 PMDs out there the next year. So obviously they're getting through their life cycle, but maybe not in the same way they used to. I know John wants to jump in, and then we'll.
You know, this can be dismissed as anecdotal, but what's, but again, as we look back, we were catching so many more fish on PMDs. 5%, you know, a quarter of what we are now. And you have these dramatic data on the quantities of the bugs in the natural state. So what do you project, assuming investing 500 hours a year and having anglers that are skilled, and in the earlier years we're catching so many more fish on the communities, and now we're catching so many fewer, and also just visually looking at the number of bugs you see on the water, it seems to correlate with it being a quarter of what it was in the past. How do you explain that?
Well, can I be cheeky? You guys are too good at fishermen. You're taking the flies too much and you're scaring the fish away.
Why weren't we doing that earlier?
Well, no, these fish live for like 20 years, right? So now they've seen your flies. And they never want to eat a PMD again because you're just too good a fisherman. Right?
That doesn't explain. That doesn't explain.
No, it doesn't. Like I said, it's cheap because I think I'll right.
No, but I really, that's so haunting to me. You're seeing these huge numbers of nymphs, and every regular on the ranch will swear that they're not seeing anywhere near. Now you don't have the chronological data.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's hard to imagine PMD abundance having been 4 times what it is now, but it's possible, I suppose, but we don't have.
Yeah, so you also have something that conflicts with this idea, right? The fact that these fish are still in good condition, right? They're still fat for their size, right?
So they're getting enough.
So they're eating. It's not like they're starving to death.
Yeah.
So and hoppers provide a hell of a lot of calories.
Yeah, they do. They do. I am not a fisherman. I'm not a fisherman biologist. I just know the bugs and stuff, right? So, but I would speculate that you know, if the hatches become less concentrated, less intense, if a moment in time, the fish might be less likely, as I understand it, to home in on them. Right? And so you may not have a loss of the bugs so much as you have a dissolution of the hatch itself. Right? I mean, it's possible. I'm not a fisherman's biologist. I'm not much of a fisherman. Right? I'm just a fisher person. But anyway, that would be my speculation.
I have a question for Rob.
Yeah.
So what is the foundation doing to address some of these concerns that John and others have brought up? To say, okay, we got the bugs, we're not getting fish, why?
Okay, well, I did not honestly plant that question. Seriously. But I will take the opportunity to answer it and address a couple other things. I guess that's the, is that my reward for having invested all the time in the seminar series all summer and convincing John to make a special trip just for this, which I really appreciate, by the way. So I guess I'm going to take the last word then, and then we've gone even past the 4:15. Let me address one thing first, which is the very basic, easiest question to answer, and that is numbers of fish. That is completely in this river, in the ranch. We're just talking, we're not talking about the same, completely driven by winter flow out of Island Park Dam. There's no question that science has been there. Jack Griffin figured that out 30 years ago. No question that there are fewer fish out there in the population right now. There are 2 big gaps in the age class because we have really poor winter flow in the winter of 2021, 22, and 22, 23. So right now we're missing the bulk of fish that should be in the population. There's no question about that. We know exactly why it's winter flow. And with our work with the irrigation district and Bureau of Reclamation, with all science-based, all data-driven, all technology-assisted. We have saved 26,000 acre-feet a year in Final Park Reservoir, over and above what it would have been without our work over the last 6 years. That equates to over 100 CFS, a 42% increase in winter flow over what it would have been without our work, and that has resulted in around an 18% increase in trout recruitment over what it would have been. It's still not what we had in the 70s and 80s and 90s, because water supply is 15% lower now than it was between 1978 and 2000. This is the easy stuff, easy to quantify. We're making a difference. Is it going to get us the numbers we want consistently year in and year out? If we can't get even a couple of decent water years in a row, no, we just can't do it. We're going to continue to work on that. We can pick around the edges, and we think we can increase winter flow a little bit more. But that's the fish part of it. There's no question there's fewer fish. We know exactly why. We're working on it, and it would be worse. Okay, that said, what about the hatches? And John's question is exactly the one to ask. It's like, or the two. You asked two questions. Should we just adapt to the new normal and just say this is how it is, climate change, other factors, development? I mean, there's a lot of things that are just happening. That's one question. And then the other one was, what can we actually make this better? So one thing that we can do, and think that we have the technology and the ability to do, is temperatures. So in the analysis of the data that Brett has helped us with, the number one factor that is responsible for declines in percent mayflies, stoneflies, and caddisflies, and then the Hills and Hop Index, which is kind of a measure of overall aquatic ecosystem health, that definitely depends on temperature. The percent mayflies, stoneflies, and caddisflies is definitely goes down when the water temperature goes up. Water temperatures are going up. They've increased, let's see, it's the 7-day maximum, which we're in the middle of probably right now, has been increasing. It's increased by almost a degree Fahrenheit in the last 45 years. That alone would explain about a 10 to 15% decline. That's not the decline, the fourfold decline you're experiencing, but that's got statistical evidence of that. There are ways to make the water cooler, and the technique that we think will work in this case is doing what we call managed aquifer recharge, but it's done via the old school traditional flood irrigation. Out on the Harriman Ranch, there is still the remnants of a flood irrigation system that was used when the Harriman's on. I don't think the state has ever used that in the 40 years it's been running the ranch, but the infrastructure is still there, and we figured we can increase the amount of cold water returning to the river via those springs and maybe cool down the ones that you've noticed have warmed up by putting water on the ground in May and June. It goes through the ground, it cools, it comes back out in July and August. Jack McLaren, who's not here today, has done a lot of work identifying where these groundwater springs emerge back to the river. They are substantially colder than the main river, and if we can, he figures we can double the amount of cold water coming back into the ranch if we do this. So there's one concrete technique that we think will help cool water temperatures. We know for sure that certain invertebrates, certain insects, especially the Drunellas, so the flavs and the green drakes, are very temperature sensitive. And so there's a concrete thing that we think we can do to improve that situation. Another thing that's interesting, John, 2020 followed the 3 best water years we've had in a quarter of a century. They were not great water years by any stretch of the imagination. They wouldn't even have made the cut in the 80s, but they were the 3 best we've had in the last 25 years, 2017, 18, and 19, those 3 water years. And all of a sudden in 2020, we had a lot of fish because we had 3 good years of winter flow, and we had the best hatches we've seen, which does tell me that these things can respond if we actually could have some water. So we're going to continue working with the irrigators. We think there's more we can do to squeeze out a little more winter flow, and the winter flow, is an issue not just for for the, trout recruitment, but it does seem to have some impact, positive impact on the invertebrates as well. So we're gonna continue to do that. Water quality, in general is an issue. We kind of talked a little bit about, and Mike brought this up, that the aquatic vegetation, we thought is where the invertebrates live, but they really don't. They really live in the substrate and gravel. We have plenty of evidence that aquatic vegetation growth has increased substantially in the last 30 years. Multiple lines of evidence for that. And so there are some ways we think we can knock that back, and one of which is a managed springtime freshet. We did that last year. It's a deliberate peak flow done in the springtime when there's some extra water, and water managers agree to do this. And that removes fine sediment, which benefits invertebrates, but it also sets the plants back because they need that fine sediment to root and to root and get their nutrients. So that's one way we can try to knock the macrophytes back and clean gravel. We can't do it every year because of water supply. We can do it every few years, and that would help. And so it's not just a one-way trip toward fine sediment and the kinds of organisms that like fine sediment. So that's another thing we're working on. And then we've got a bunch of other things we're looking at in the Island Park Reservoir to improve water quality in the reservoir. Real geeky things like literally stirring it up to keep it from stratifying so that it keeps more dissolved oxygen at the bottom, which promotes better kinds of production in the reservoir versus harmful algae, which then just recycles nutrients, delivers more poor quality water in the river. So we've got a whole suite of things we're looking at, actually real hardcore mechanical, things in the reservoir that we think will improve water quality. Is any of this, is all that stuff going to get us back to 1983 now? But we do know pieces that work. We do have these statistical connections. We do know we can make